I still can't step foot in a movie theater. Not after that night. Not after what I saw. July 20th, 2012. Midnight. The Dark Knight Rises. The biggest movie of the summer. I had been looking forward to it for months. I remember the excitement buzzing through the crowd as we waited in our seats at the Century 16 Theater in Aurora, Colorado. People were dressed in Batman shirts, some even in costumes. The air smelled like buttery popcorn in anticipation. I was with my best friend, Chris. We found seats somewhere in the middle. Perfect view. Perfect experience. The lights dimmed, and the previews started rolling. For a moment, everything felt right. Safe. Then, just as the movie began, the side exit door near the screen swung open. It was strange because that door should have been locked. A figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the dim theater lights. At first, I thought it was some latecomer sneaking in, maybe an employee, but then I saw it. His black tactical gear, the dark helmet, the way he moved with terrifying purpose. And then, the canister. A small metal cylinder flew through the air, landing near the front rows. It clattered on the ground, spinning for a moment before spewing thick, white gas. My chest tightened as the air filled with acrid smoke. People coughed. Someone laughed, thinking it was some elaborate prank. Then, the gunfire started. A rapid pop, pop, pop cut through the laughter, the confusion. The screen was still playing, Batman's dark figure looming over Gotham, but reality was far more terrifying. Sparks exploded from the walls as bullets ripped through the theater. Screams erupted, drowning out the movie's booming soundtrack. I ducked before I even knew what was happening. Chris grabbed my arm and yanked me down between the seats. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would explode. More shots, more screams. The gunman moved methodically, firing into the crowd. I heard a horrible, wet thunk as someone in front of me was hit. A woman wailed in agony. The smell of gunpowder, blood, and sweat filled my nostrils. People ran for the exits, but the aisles were packed, bodies trampling over each other. Some tried to play dead, others crouched low, frozen in terror. I peeked up just enough to see him standing in the smoke-filled aisle. The gas made his presence even more nightmarish, like some kind of inhuman monster stalking his prey. His rifle swung left, right, each movement followed by a burst of gunfire. I saw a young man trying to shield his girlfriend. A second later, both of them were on the floor, motionless. I couldn't breathe. My hands shook uncontrollably. I gripped Chris's wrist so tightly my nails dug into his skin. He whispered, "Don't move." The shooting went on forever. Minutes stretched into an eternity. I could hear people sobbing, whispering prayers, pleading for it to stop. And then, silence. I didn't know if he was reloading or if it was finally over. My ears rang from the gunfire, my body frozen in sheer terror. A faint mechanical clicking sound, the unmistakable noise of a weapon being adjusted, made me squeeze my eyes shut, waiting for the end. Suddenly, a distant commotion, sirens, shouting. The police were here. The nightmare wasn't over, but the monster had been stopped. Chris and I stayed crouched until officers came rushing in, their voices commanding, urgent. "Get out! Move! Move!" I forced myself to stand, my legs like jelly. Around me, the theater was a scene of horror. Bodies slumped over seats, blood pooling on the floor. The screen still flickered, playing scenes from a movie no one had been able to watch. I stumbled outside into the cold night air. The parking lot was a frenzy of flashing lights, crying survivors, frantic families, reporters, cameras, chaos. Chris was still clutching my hand, both of us covered in the horror of what we had just survived. 12 people never made it out alive that night. 70 others were injured. I can never forget their faces, the ones who didn't move when the lights came on, the ones who would never go home, the ones whose final moments were spent in terror. Even now, years later, I still hear the echoes of those screams in my nightmares. The gunfire, the gas, the horror. I flinch at loud noises, avoid crowded places, and I haven't set foot in a theater since, because no movie, no matter how good, is worth reliving that night. I've always loved horror movies, the thrill, the suspense, the adrenaline. But after what happened that night in 1980, I can never watch The Shining the same way again. It was a chilly October evening in Long Island, the kind where the air smelled like burning leaves and the promise of winter. A A few friends and I decided to catch a late-night showing of The Shining at a small, dimly lit theater tucked between a liquor store and a closed-down diner. The place was packed, mostly young adults like us, eager to experience Stanley Kubrick's terrifying vision of Stephen King's novel. We bought our tickets, grabbed some popcorn, and settled into our seats near the middle of the auditorium. The seats were worn, the armrests a little sticky, but none of that mattered once the lights dimmed and the screen flickered to life. That's when I first noticed him, a man sitting a few rows ahead of us, alone, hunched forward, fingers twitching on the armrest. He wasn't just watching the movie, he was absorbing it, leaning in like he was hanging onto every word. He was pale, gaunt, his greasy brown hair sticking to his forehead. I remember nudging my friend, whispering, "Dude, that guy's creeping me out." My friend just shrugged. The movie played on. Jack Nicholson's descent into madness filled the screen, his eyes wild, his grin unsettling. The eerie music seeped into my bones. But the man in front of us, he was more unsettling than the movie itself. He twitched whenever Jack Torrance did something violent. When Jack slammed the axe into the door, the man flinched. When he yelled at Wendy, the man grinned. And when Jack uttered those infamous words, "Here's Johnny," the man suddenly bolted upright. Then it happened. A scream tore through the theater. At first, I thought it was part of the movie, a perfectly timed reaction. But then the screaming didn't stop. It became shrill, desperate, filled with raw agony. People turned their heads, confusion morphing into terror. I saw the man, Michael J. Townley, standing in the aisle, his face contorted in some kind of twisted ecstasy, and in his hand, glinting under the flickering light of the screen, was a hunting knife. The blade was deep in the side of another man's stomach. Gasps. Chaos. The victim, a young guy in his 20s, clutched at the knife, buried in his ribs, his white shirt blooming red. He collapsed into his seat, struggling to breathe. The attacker didn't run. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, panting, his hand still gripping the knife handle like he had just awakened from a trance. Screams filled the theater. People bolted for the exits. Others froze in shock. My heart slammed against my ribs. The film was still playing, but no one was watching anymore. The victim moaned in agony, slumping against the seat as blood dripped onto the sticky theater floor. I was paralyzed, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Then, someone tackled Townley. A group of men, moviegoers just like me, rushed him, pinning him to the ground. He struggled, thrashing like a wild animal, eyes rolling back as if he were still lost in some nightmare. Seconds later, ushers burst in, their flashlights bouncing wildly. The house lights flickered on, exposing the horror that had unfolded. The victim groaned as a woman pressed napkins against his wound, desperate to slow the bleeding. "Townley?" He was laughing. His breathless, wheezing chuckle filled the stunned silence. "It's just a movie," he muttered, his voice eerily calm. "Just a movie." Police arrived minutes later, yanking him up and dragging him out. His eyes scanned the theater one last time before he disappeared into the flashing red and blue of the patrol cars outside. The victim survived, but I don't know if he ever stepped into a theater again. I barely could. The idea that a man could watch a horror movie and then become. The horror was something I couldn't shake. Even now, when I hear Jack Nicholson's infamous "Here's Johnny" line, I don't think about the movie. I think about the blood, the screams, the man with the knife, standing in the glow of the silver screen, lost in a nightmare of his own making. I never believed in ghosts. I'd heard stories, of course, whispers from the old employees at the theater, tales of flickering lights and moving shadows, but I was a skeptic. I thought people just wanted to make an old building feel spookier than it was. Then, I started working the late shift. It was 1991, and I had been the projectionist at the El Paso Grand Theater for about 6 months. The place had been around since the early 1900s, a relic of a time when going to the movies was an event, not just something to kill an afternoon. The walls were faded, the seats creaky, and the floors forever sticky, no matter how much we mopped. But I liked it. It was quiet, and I could be alone in the booth, running the reels, letting the hum of the projector drown out the world. That night, I was running a late screening of Cape Fear. The theater was mostly empty, just a few stragglers sitting far apart, lost in their popcorn and sodas. The only light in the booth came from the glow of the projector as I carefully threaded the next reel into place. Then I heard it. A whisper, You shouldn't be here. I froze. The words were so soft, so close, like someone was standing just behind me, breathing them into my ear. I spun around, heart hammering, expecting to see someone there, but the booth was empty. Just the old, dust-covered equipment, the battered wooden chair in the corner, and the tiny window overlooking the theater below. My mind scrambled for a logical explanation. Maybe it was the sound of the film, a weird echo from the speakers. I shook it off and turned back to the projector. Then the lights flickered. Not just a little flicker. The bulbs above me dimmed, then flared so brightly I had to squint before cutting out completely. The only light left was from the flickering frames of the film still rolling through the projector. My breath came fast and shallow. Then the chair moved. I saw it with my own eyes. The old wooden chair in the corner scraped against the floor and slid 2 feet across the room, all on its own. I backed up so fast I nearly tripped over the film reel stacked behind me. My skin was cold, my stomach tight. I wanted to run, but I was frozen. The chair sat motionless now, as if daring me to come closer. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the soft whir of the projector. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then something breathed. Not the whisper from before. This was different. A slow, deliberate exhale, just inches behind me. The kind of sound a person makes when they're standing so close you can feel their breath on your skin. I spun around, expecting, praying, to see a coworker playing a prank. There was no one there. I stumbled backward, my legs shaking. The darkness in the booth felt thick, pressing against me. The shadows in the corners seemed darker now, stretching unnaturally toward me. Then, the whisper came again, clearer this time. You shouldn't be here. That was it. I bolted. I threw the door open and nearly fell down the narrow stairs leading to the main floor. The moment I hit the lobby, the warm glow of the marquee lights felt like stepping into salvation. A few employees stood behind the concession stand, chatting idly. They looked up, startled by my sudden appearance. One of them, Maria, raised an eyebrow. You okay, David? You look like you've seen a ghost. I swallowed hard. My hands were still trembling. Did anyone come up to the booth just now? She shook her head. No. Why? I hesitated. Saying it out loud felt ridiculous. I heard something. A voice. And the lights flickered. Mariah and the others exchanged glances, that uneasy, knowing kind of look. Finally, she sighed and leaned on the counter. Yeah, she said quietly. That happens sometimes. My stomach twisted. What do you mean? The guy who worked up there before you? Maria continued. Miguel. He used to tell us the same thing. Said he'd hear voices when he was alone. One night, he saw something move in the corner of the booth and refused to go back up there. Quit the next day. I stared at her, my mouth dry. Then Jose, one of the older employees, chimed in. They say it's him, he muttered. Who? I asked. The old projectionist, back when the theater was new. He fell from the booth one night. Some say he jumped, others say he was pushed. He let that last word hang in the air, watching my reaction. Ever since then, well, people see things up there. I felt my skin crawl. Maria shrugged. We all just learn to ignore it. As long as you don't mess with him, he won't mess with you. I looked back at the stairs leading up to the booth. A shadow lingered at the top. Or maybe it was just my imagination. That was my last shift, alone in the projection booth. I started working day shifts, making sure I was never up there by myself again. A few weeks later, I quit altogether. I never told my replacement what happened. Thank you for watching. Make sure you subscribe for more horror stories.